Sanaë Lemoine was born in Paris to a Japanese mother and French father and raised in France and Australia. She earned her undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania and her MFA at Columbia University, and she now lives in Brooklyn, New York. Sanaë, thank you so much for being with us tonight at the library. We're so thrilled to have you, and thank you for your beautiful, beautiful novel, The Margot Affair.
Thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
So to get started, I mean, I read the novel this weekend, and I was kind of rereading it just now in preparation for the event, but we can't assume that everyone in the audience has read it or read it in its entirety. And so if you could briefly, very, very briefly describe, what kind of is what's the premise of the novel?
Yeah, so The Margot Affair takes place in Paris, and it's the story of a 17-year-old girl, Margot, who's the hidden daughter of a French politician and a stage actress. And her entire life, she's yearned to be recognized by her father, to be his legitimate child. And the summer that she turns 17, she by chance meets a journalist and decides to finally tell him about her father's identity. And the novel explores the aftermath of this reveal. So Margot moving from this hidden, invisible life to this very public, visible status, and the repercussions of her choice to reveal the secret of her family.
And you, of course, have a personal link to this story. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. When I was 21, I found out that my father had a second family. He told me the summer I graduated from college that while he was married to my mother, he'd started a relationship with another woman, and that they had a son together, and she was expecting their second. And I started writing this novel a couple of months after that revelation. And I wanted to take what at the time felt like a private upheaval, but something that I was working through and had a lot of questions about, and write about it in a fictional form, take the emotions and the questions that I had and transform them into the story of this hidden child. So it was kind of an act of real imagination and maybe empathy to imagine the other side, because I had not been the hidden child in my own family history.
Yeah, I'm really glad you used the word empathy, because that is something that I really noticed throughout the novel, and I really would love to talk about that as we move forward. Just to kind of lay just two more pieces of groundwork for kind of an American, perhaps audience, French audience. Can you just speak briefly to the Mitterrand story as well, and then also to Bonjour Tristesse, which I think are kind of two other foundational pieces to the Margot Affair?
Yes, so François Mitterrand, former president of France, had a hidden daughter, Mazarine Pinjot, who I think was 18 years old or so when she became known to the public. And it's a story that I'd always known about, being half French and living here, but that I learned more about when I worked for a journalist, Elaine Cholino, who some of you may know because she has done events at the American Library of Paris. And she asked me to research Mazarine Pinjot for her novel, The Seduction. And I read Mazarine's book, because Mazarine is today an author. She's written several books, and she wrote an autobiographical book about her childhood as a hidden child. And that's when I really discovered what her life had been, and what her relationship with her father was like, which was a very tender, loving one, but also it was a complicated and painful one. I didn't know that there'd be any kind of echo with my life when I was researching this project. But I thought about it when I started writing my novel, and especially because I chose the daughter of a politician, not the president, but someone who has a public life, because I really wanted to explore that theme of moving from invisibility to visibility in this kind of more amplified, extreme way. That wasn't the experience I had had, but it was something that interested me. And then Bonjour Tristesse is so a novel that was written, oh gosh, I think in the 50s by Françoise Sagan, who at the time was 18, very young when she wrote it and published it. And it's a book that I discovered, I think, in my mid-20s. So I'd already started writing this novel. But what really struck me about it and why I ended up incorporating it in my novel is the fact that the author was so young when she wrote it, similar in age to the narrator in my novel, and that she was this really interesting and beautiful mix of naive um, and impulsive and rash, but also incredibly wise and precocious. And it was just like that intensity stood out to me and inspired me. And I thought I have to in some way like integrate it into what I'm writing.
Right, and in many ways, I think, you know, Margot is infused by this dichotomy between, as you say, naive and wise. Can you speak a little bit about Margot and her age? Because I know that you had kind of been going back and forth with, or experimenting with different ages for Margot and kind of, I suppose, different kind of personalities as a result of her age. And why did you finally settle on a precocious but very stressed lycée student at the age of 17?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I did go back and forth. I had a draft of the novel where Margot is in her first year of university, so a year older. And then I think I really found her voice in writing the 17-year-old. She's right on the cusp of adulthood. She's starting her last year of high school. It's a very intense year in France. You're preparing for the bac. You know, your life, your future sort of depends on that year and working towards those exams. But she's also discovering her identity as a woman, as she's seeing the women around her in a different way. Her relationship with her mother is a very complicated and fraught one. And I thought about my own experiences as a 17-year-old. My life was a lot less interesting than Margot's, but just like that intensity of everything feeling like it's almost the end of the world, or like always being on a precipice of some kind. And I wanted that to fuel her voice and her view on the world, and this sense of discovering your power and maybe knowing, and your agency, and knowing, thinking that you know how the adult world works, or finally being invited into it, you know, not being a complete stranger to it, but still having so little foresight, and so little experience. And I think Margot is an interesting character because she was raised in this unusual household, just with her mother, but her father would visit. She's been kept a secret, and I think that the weight of the secret and that silence has also maybe contributed to her precociousness, or her ability to maybe you know, deal with a stressful situation. And yet at the same time, she is so young in the way that a 17-year-old is.
Were there other kind of characteristics or features of Margot that you know tried on and then took off as you, because we have to kind of share this, but you spent, you know, much of your 20s, I think 9 years writing and rewriting different drafts. What other parts of Margot changed or developed? Or
yeah, I started writing this novel in 2012, so when I was 22, and finished writing it around 2019, so almost 8 years. And Margot's character did change. The biggest change was giving her more agency, and having her be the one to spill the secret of her family. That came around halfway through. And I think at first I was having events happen to her rather than having her take control of her life. And that became really important when that dynamic shifted. And I think more compelling for the storyline, because then she has to deal with the consequences of her actions and those repercussions, which if you read the novel, you'll see are often painful, and kind of trigger her coming of age throughout the year. And then the other thing that I really explored over several years was allowing her to be at times an unattractive character. You know, she doesn't always make the best decisions. She is not always likable. She will frustrate you. Sometimes, you know, some readers might really not like her at times, and it's
What do you find frustrating about her?
um, I think, you know, at times she's just so unaware of 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 the consequences of her actions. I mean, what I hoped to do was to have this contrast between what she tells the reader and what she's thinking, and then what the reader knows, which, if you're an adult reader, is a lot more than she does. And so you have this kind of bird's eye view of what's happening, even though it's this very intimate first person narrative. And also the fact that there's so much that she doesn't understand about her parents, their union, and her mother. And so I wanted there to be that kind of like tension or friction between the two. I mean, I hope that you still, you know, are that you still feel tenderness towards her, because I did very much when I was writing her. But you know, she is imperfect, and you know, at times maybe, I don't know, a little spoiled in the way that teenage girls can be, or like, yeah, yeah.
No, I think, I mean, she's charming, and I think, you know, as we can all relate to the kind of intensity of being that young, and feeling, you know, intensity added only by a hot Parisian summer as well. Which, you know, it depends on how many people in the audience have kind of lived through, you know, late July and August in Paris, but it kind of really, it can really churn emotions at any age, you know?
Especially there's no AC, and it's just that like heat that's absorbed by, you know, the pavement and the buildings, and it really peaks at 5 p.m., 4 or 5 p.m., I think.
Mm, mm, mm. Um, I wanted to ask you about a beautiful quote that I had heard you say in an interview, and you had said, you know, 8 years is a long time to write anything, I imagine. And you had said that you had the impression that, I'm not sure if this is your impression in general, but you certainly had this impression with this book, and you said that the book grows with the author. Can you speak a
Yeah.
little bit more about that? You know, this, do you think that, and maybe this is kind of taking it too far, but do you think that you giving Margot more agency was also kind of a reflection of you feeling more powerful as you got older in your 20s?
Yeah, no, I'm sure it was, and that's such an insightful parallel. Um, and I think it was, I was always a, well, growing up, I was very quiet and spent most of my time reading, and didn't really care for social interactions outside of my books, and was, and that shyness carried through high school and college. But at some point you're out in the world and you have jobs and you're working for a journalist who asks you to pick up the phone. And so I think there definitely must have been a parallel there in terms of me discovering my voice and my power, and also my ability to write and feel more confident in my craft. I think there are two things that happen. One is the growth of your life as a writer, and learning how to write a novel, how to structure a book, how to revise, how to throw out writing and then start from scratch, and just like that resilience that you build over years of rejection, and you know, not getting where you hoped you would. And then there's also just life itself, and that reflecting in, I think, the whole cast of characters in the novel. So in order to write the Margot's parents, especially her mother, I feel like I had to maybe grow closer to an age that where you start asking yourself questions about motherhood. Even though the novel is just told from Margot's point of view, I think it was important for me to be able to really grasp the concerns of the other characters, who surround her, the adult characters, and I became more interested in them as time went on, and as I moved away from my 17-year-old self and closer to the older characters in the book.
So that's really interesting. So you found yourself maybe fleshing out their kind of their narratives in the story as you got closer to their age. Right.
Yes, yeah, that really happened.
Can you give me an example of one character who maybe as you got older you came to understand, more? Or
yeah, I think it's really the mother character, Anouk, who the mother-daughter relationship was always there from the beginning, but not in the form that it is in this book. It now I think it's really the central running thread. The novel opens with Margot and her mother, and I won't reveal the ending, but it carries through until the last page. There's a chapter early on in the book that is told from the mother's point of view, and that one was added much later on. It's a story that she recounts to Margot about her pregnancy and her early relationship with Margot's father and the decision to stay with him and for them to form this hidden secret family. And that was a chapter that, even though it's close to the beginning of the novel, it came much later in the drafting process.
I mean, just kind of continuing on this theme of process, and you had kind of described that it's almost as if the book had a life of its own, and you would kind of write and you'd think you'd finish and you'd put it aside, and then you described it as a kind of resurfacing. How many times did you really think you had finished? And then how did you know finally after 8 years that it was done?
Yeah.
Do you find that it still resurfaces somehow?
That's such a beautiful word, resurfacing, which I hadn't thought of, but it really, the way that
it's your word. I'm just
really? I don't remember it. Amazing.
It's beautiful because it implies that it's never, you're never really going to get rid of it.
No, it's true. The way this novel existed in my mind is that it was always there. The characters became kind of like family, and they were living their lives in the back of my head. And I sometimes had a job as a cookbook editor, other things happening in my life, but they were always there doing eating meals and walking around Paris. And whenever I worked on the book, I would kind of open that door and jump back into that space, or the movie would turn on. I don't know if there were moments when I felt that the book was done. There were moments when I felt that it was good enough to send out to agents. And then there were moments where I felt it was good enough for us to find an editor. It was more that I knew that there were these important stages in the process of writing and publishing a book. And I trusted experts such as my agent to know that it was in a good enough place to send to editors. Otherwise, I think I could have continued working on it endlessly. And then in terms of the final draft, it was really my editor wrangling it from me and saying, okay, now we're sending it to the copy editor. Now we're putting it in layouts, now you can't change any more sentences. But even today, I mean, when I read it, I have this impulse I can't read too closely because I can see things that I would want to change. I mean, a published book is really just like a point in time. It's the best work maybe that you could put forth at the time of its publication. It's such a sort of, I don't know, there's something like very fixed about it, which is, but the life of the novel is so kind of organic and fluid. And I think of it as this organic thing. And then the novel is just like one little, moment in its life. And then there was a French translation. So there was this whole other, there was like this second life to the book as well, where I was working with the French translator and thinking about word choices. And so I thought the novel was done, and then suddenly it wasn't. It was going through another transformation.
What did you learn about the book that you hadn't known before by helping with the translation?
A couple of typos. Translators are very careful, so they read. No. Well, one thing that, this might not perfectly answer your question, but one thing that I thought about when I was writing this book, which is in English, but takes place in France, and all the characters are French and speaking to each other in French, was that I wanted it to feel very seamless for the reader. My hope is that when you read it, you feel that the characters are speaking to each other in French, but in a way that is immersive, not alienating, or not. I don't want it to feel like a translation, but I really wanted kind of the spirit of French language to come through. And so I read a lot in French. I always do, but I was reading in French. I was reading translations sometimes. I was thinking about dialogue, especially, like, is this something that one could say in French? So
what kind of things were you reading?
Oh gosh. Books that, I mean, things that I could read really quickly, actually. So I don't know, like French bestsellers. No, there is this book that I really loved that I found quite inspiring, which is, it came out maybe 10 or so years ago. It's by Delphine de Vigan, and it's about her mother. She's written many books, but this one is specifically about her mother, and it's a mother-daughter autobiographical novel. And that was a book that I returned to for that relationship. And then I really love The Lover by Marguerite Duras. That is also a book that I can just reread a million times, and I love to go back between the French and the translation. But so there is something funny that happened when we were working on the translation, where it was the reverse. I mean, I had sometimes dreamed up words or portions of dialogue in French and then written them in English. And now we were, moving back, and sometimes it feels very seamless in the French translation, and other times I read a section and I think, oh, it's so much better in English. So it was, I mean, we're always our harshest critic as the writer, but it was kind of this sort of like magical but a little strange experience.
Do you think anything was lost or gained in terms of the narrative?
Yeah, I
imagine the sections about food. You were kind of
yeah.
channeling your inner Proust.
I think that the translator ended up doing a really beautiful job, because he put so much of his heart and soul into it. And it's a male translator. He's not 17 years old. He never met me. We exchanged a lot over email, but we to this day haven't met. And yet I feel like he was really able to get into Margot's skin and her voice in this kind of extraordinary way. However, as someone who reads for sentences and loves sentences, I do feel like there was maybe a little bit that, I don't know if that's lost in translation, but I thought a lot about rhythm. And even on the opening page, the first sentence of the book, on stage my mother was her truest self, that was a difficult sentence to translate. And I feel like it just doesn't have the same musicality and rhythm than in the English.
Interesting. Yeah, great. This is
not to dissuade anyone from reading it in French if you prefer reading French.
Well, you can do what you do with Dera, and you can get both, and then you
Yeah.
can you can be the judge.
Yeah.
This is actually a kind of a hole. We've fallen down a rabbit hole, and I want to keep falling, because I'm really curious. You've had a kind of virtual. So you published this on the kind of the cusp of COVID, right? It was last year. And so then I imagine you had a kind of American book tour, but all virtual. And now you're kind of in the midst, coming to the end of your French tour, which you said a lot of it, which is in person. Have you noticed? And I'm preparing for this, I watched your American interviews and also your French ones, and I didn't watch enough to kind of make this call. But do you notice that the French do highlight different things about the novel than your American, interviewers and the American media?
Yes, they really do. The positioning actually from the beginning was really different. So this book it's kind of, I think, a very rich book to publicize if you're a publicist, because there's so many entryways to the book. There's the mother-daughter relationship. It's a coming-of-age story. There's the theme of motherhood, of even sexual discovery, of the father and daughter as well. It's a book that mothers have given to their daughters, daughters have given to their mothers or grandmothers, that fathers have really responded to as well. That 17-year-olds, for instance, the 17-year-old boy who was going through a really difficult divorce with his parents, really responded to Margot's story. So it's had this really wide reach, but it is set in Paris. And that was very much the positioning that the publishing house in the US chose. This, I think, to also appeal to Francophiles, and also to appeal to readers who would want to be transported to another place, which ended up working nicely because most of us were not traveling last summer when the novel came out. And of course, in France, the positioning isn't going to be, this is a very French book, or this book takes place in France. That's a lot less interesting to French readers. So the focus has been more on the coming of age story, on the mother-daughter story, a lot less on the food writing. That was something that was more of a focus in the US. There are a lot of food descriptions in this book, and I have a background as a cookbook editor. So it's always fascinating to see, whether it's in one country or another, or even just among different ages and different life experiences, to see how people enter a fictional world, and how it works in this very surprising way. You just never know what will move you, what will resonate with you. And in turn, I find that so moving when someone comes to me and has never been to France, or maybe, has a completely different experience from Margot's, and yet there's something in the story that echoed with their personal life. And, that's how they found their way in.
Yeah, I had wondered, did you have, readers who were themselves children, children of secret families, or kind of secret family, a response from that kind of, I imagine, smaller, but, it's such a kind of intimate point, and I was wondering if you had responses from that kind of.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of there are so many families that take different configurations, and whether it is someone who discovered that their parent had another family, or even I think any kind of upheaval, family upheaval. I have gotten several private messages from readers who there was something that had a parallel to their life, and to whether it was specifically the relationship with their mother, or a story of infidelity. Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, it's not that surprising maybe that it is as common as it ended up being.
Yeah, and these are all such sensitive topics, and I think you handle them so carefully and beautifully in the novel. And I think, I had wondered this also about you as the author, speaking so kind of candidly about your personal experience. I mean, was that ever a question? Did you know, kind of going into the publicity of the book, that you would end up sharing, the intimate details of your family's life and history?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, I didn't. In fact, about a year before publication, all authors at the publishing house where this book was published are asked to fill out a publicity questionnaire. And one of the questions is, how did this novel originate? What was the inspiration? And then a bunch of other questions. And it's kind of prep for interviews, and also for the publisher to know how to position the book when they start preparing the marketing campaign. And in that first questionnaire, I didn't say anything about my family. It was just, it was all about craft and how I wrote the book and the characters. And I did have a little kind of parentheses at some point that was just for my editor. And I said, just for you, but not for anyone else. actually this happened in my family, and I don't want to talk about it, but I just, in case you find out, and I don't want it to be awkward, but my father had a second family, and and at some point she wrote back saying, I just want to check in, like, have you thought about it more? Would you like to talk about it? You don't have to, but I just want to circle back to it. And I started thinking about it more and more closer to publication. Um, and I don't know when the shift happened, but it I think I hadn't realized what a big part of the book it was. I think a part of me had separated those two experiences, the experience of writing this novel, and then the personal inspiration and my relationship with my parents. And maybe I had wanted them to really exist on different planes. And then as I was preparing to talk about the book and prepping interview questions, I realized that they were just so linked, and that this novel was a way for me to try to answer questions that I didn't have the answers um, to try to maybe even tell my parents things that I wasn't able to articulate. Um, that was all there, even if it wasn't visible or fully conscious to me at the time of writing. And so I tried it out. I tried talking about it in early interviews, and it made sense. And so I continued, and in parallel I was talking to my parents about it, and you know um, they read the book right when it was published. So it wasn't a complete surprise when I started discussing such personal matters.
Yeah, and do you feel that the reaction, whether well in the press, has been sensitive? I mean, because one of Margot's great fears in the novel is that you write that she dreads interviews, she dreads the press.
Yeah.
And when this finally does come out about her, there's this kind of like splashy, catchy headline, lives a double life, exclamation point. And there's this wonderful line right towards the end. I'm not gonna, ruin anything, but it's written about several times. It has a few iterations, let's say, of being written about. And one character, Bridget, dismisses the fact that this has been written about, and she says, Margot, it's just an article. And then Margot says, it's my life.
Yeah.
I was thinking, it's your life, Sanaë, and do you feel that have you been satisfied with the reception of such a deeply personal, your emotions? I think you're so brave, but
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about it most intimately, it's actually usually in book clubs, because that's when, I don't know, there's something about the intimacy of that space, even though it's on Zoom and everyone knows each other. I don't know them, but they all know each other already. So there's a level of comfort. And so um, that's usually where kind of the more difficult questions come up. And yet, every time it's been so empathetic and insightful, and I learned things about myself even. And maybe there's something about the video format that I mean, I haven't experienced it in person, but maybe because everyone's in their home and comfortable, and I don't know, there's this like strange intimacy that happens that I wonder if it would be there if we were, if I was not on a stage, but in front of a room of people talking. Um, and it's come up maybe actually more in France. I feel like journalists here are maybe more curious about my background and my family, whereas in the US the focus has been more on the themes and the characters and craft. So in the past couple of weeks, with the publication of the French edition, which came out in April, early April, I've had to think about what I'm comfortable saying and what I'm comfortable, or what I don't want to reveal. And there's always a level of performance when you're talking about a work of art and yourself, especially to a journalist. So yeah, there are moments where I catch myself mid sentence or mid thought, and knowing that my parents will listen, people who know them, people who don't know them. as well, my cousins. It's especially now that some of these things are in French, it does open it up to my father's side of the family a lot more than it did before.
Yeah, you used the word empathy, and you had used the word empathy at the beginning, and I just kept writing it in the margins kind of all the way through. But there are three moments in particular. I think there are two fascinating things. One is that you might think at first glance this is a story about the daughter and her father, and actually it turns out it's much more about the women in the novel. And you had kind of mentioned that earlier. And the second thing I think is that it seems again at first glance so clear. Here is this politician, he has a secret family. How unfair, how classically French. And you really just you're so much smarter than that kind of reading, and you offer so much, I think, beautiful empathy towards the father figure. And so I just wanted to read three moments in particular. I was so moved, Sanaë. You said, and this is Margot's kind of trying to understand maybe why her father had done it, and even I think taking that step and saying, I want to understand where this came from, I think is beautiful. So she says, I provided an outlet for him. I think our relationship presented itself as carefree and uncomplicated. It fulfilled a part of him he'd kept repressed for years. So, it's a liberating force. And then later you write, according to Margot, there had been a hole in his life that needed filling. For years we had made him whole. That's who we were, and I drew comfort from this. And then towards the end, you have, she's kind of, Margot's being interviewed by somebody, and that person's asking questions. And even just, you, I guess, asking the kind of questions that, even asking the questions about why somebody might do this, I think is already a kind of radical act of empathy. But I mean, do you have answers? Questions for your father? I mean, do you feel that, why do you think he had a second family? And do you feel that, having finished this book, that you understand? And do you understand second families?
I mean, what really interested me was this idea of sharing, suddenly sharing a family. That I remember when I found out that my father had this other family, it was from one day to the next. There's no preparation of, oh, I've met someone and now we're married, or now she's pregnant and you'll have a sibling in a couple of months. And it was very sudden, and suddenly there are these little half brothers who have this connection to me, and one day they'll be a part of my life. But I thought about that how the thing that we shared was that we both were children of a father who had deliberately divided his time in this kind of secretive way. And what did that mean? And especially as a young adult, or 17-year-old, I think you would ask yourself questions of, am I more or less loved, or is this person dividing his love? And one thing that Margot really seeks in the novel is her father's love, which expresses itself in terms of her legitimacy, but also just love. And some of these questions were questions that I never had the courage or even the ability to articulate to my father. And I hoped that he would read this book and understand that I was addressing the questions to him, and also it was my attempt to understand a lot of the tenderness and love that I felt towards him, even as I was jarred and upset. Like you can have those different emotions existing at the same time, and so I was really interested in that, like the messiness of those different feelings. I don't have the answers to those questions. However, what was really extraordinary and surprising is that after the book was published, my father and I did have a conversation about what had happened 10 years before and how it had deeply affected me. he had asked me to not tell my mom. She didn't know for a little while. So that had been really difficult too. And he apologized after so many years of not talking about it. He doesn't like to talk about his emotions. Um, so, something came out of it. I don't know if it was an answer, but an openness that hadn't been there, and a willingness to acknowledge the ways that we'd been hurt, but also that we love each other. And yeah.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely lovely. So if you, and I'm looking at the time, and I'm also, we are receiving more questions and comments than normal, which is only a testament to your brilliance and clearly, the brilliance of the book. If you haven't posted your question or comment already, please do go ahead and post, because I will now be looking at the chat and moderating the chat as seamlessly as possible. So let's see, I guess, we can just continue along this maybe more personal side, because a lot of people are interested in your family's reaction. And I guess we kind of got the answer here, that maybe it kind of softened a conversation, or loosened up things, that may facilitated a conversation that might otherwise not have happened. But initially, let's say, Martha wants to know, what was the reaction to the book from your family? I mean, initial reactions. I had read in an interview, you said that your mother was so thrilled to read that the mother figure was a terrible cook, because your mother's a really wonderful cook.
Yes, I was most worried
about
in
the realm of fiction, because
I know. No, and it's so funny because I mean, the book is very much a novel, and there's so much that it is pure fiction and invention. And so I had some very funny comments. For instance, my father saying, "I also wear a white apron." But it's like, yeah, I mean, so many people do, but I'm glad that you recognize yourself there. For my mom,
yeah, you're like, out of all of the pieces that I've laid out in front of you,
it's the apron. Yes. I was most worried about my mom reading it, because our relationship was not always easy, like the mother and daughter in this book. But today we're very close, and we're finally able to have open conversations. And so I don't know, I was afraid that maybe it would change something, or that it would be painful for her to relive um, some of what she had gone through 10 years ago, and set aside. And I think it was hard for her, and she read it slowly, but also I don't know, she's been so, in a way, surprisingly supportive. And my mother's Japanese, and she usually doesn't express affection verbally, or she is a wonderful cook, and shows her love through her food. But she has been a big cheerleader of the book in ways that feel very un-Japanese and uncharacteristic of her. So that has been wonderful. And now my cousins, who I'm close to, have read it, and I have to remember that it's also a bit their story, because they're from my father's side of the family. And I think when you write a book that is a novel, and I think of it as a novel and as fiction, I sometimes forget that there are elements that to family members might feel recognizable, even if they weren't intended to be that way, but that because they know me, the author, they will read it that way, and they'll have a special personal connection to it.
I'm getting lots of questions about your identity as French, and then also American, Japanese. So, people want to know, do you speak to your mum in French, English, or Japanese? I, of course, know the crazy answers to this, but I'll just read a few more. One person, why do you have an American accent? And then there's one more question, but can you speak about your mother's?
So my dad is French, my mom's Japanese, and she was born in Japan, but she spent a lot of time in South America, notably Argentina. So she raised me and my older brother, in speaking Spanish. So at home, it was a little chaotic. My dad would speak to us in French and would speak to my mom in French, and my mom would only speak in Spanish. They both speak French and Spanish. And then at school, I started to learn English when we moved to Australia when I was 4. And I had a very strong Australian accent until I was, well, until I was around 12. We moved back to France. And there I went to a French international school. Some of you might know it, the Lycée International de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. And I was in the American section. So that's when I started acquiring my American accent and losing the Australian accent. And then I came to the US for college, and have stayed there ever since. So yeah, that's kind of the complicated backstory to my identity.
That's fascinating. And since this is a question from Dave/Mary, so I imagine this, yeah, well, I won't speculate, but they want to know, since you speak French, did you ever consider doing the French version yourself? As in, why did you, turn to a translator when perhaps you couldn't?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm more comfortable in English. So we moved to Australia when I was 4, and I went to an Australian school. It wasn't a bilingual education, and I learned to read and write in English. I was still speaking in French to my father. But when I came back to France, I went to a French school, but that had a bilingual component. But I think because I fell in love with reading and writing in English, it just kind of was always my language of comfort for writing. And then I studied creative writing in the US. And it never occurred to me to translate the book myself. First of all, I think that's such an art, to translate. Especially a novel, it's a really particular skill. And then I didn't feel that I had the vocabulary to, like the knowledge of French language, to recreate the most authentic and faithful version of the book.
And now the book, I think I can say, because I heard in a French interview this morning, I don't think it was given this morning, but I listened to it this morning, that Disney has bought the rights.
Yeah, they option the rights. So it doesn't mean that anything will necessarily get done, but it means that they have the ability to maybe adapt it to the TV. So it's a little complicated. I didn't know much about Hollywood before this process, but it's 20th Century, which belongs to Disney, and they're most known for Hulu and Fox. So the idea would be that it would indeed be an adaptation of the novel into a TV show, set in France with a French cast. But yeah, I guess keep your eyes out for it, but it might not be for a very long time.
Have you thought, we can kind of project into the future here, from English into French, and now from literature onto the screen? Do you expect to learn kind of more about the story in this maybe potentially next process of I wouldn't say translation, but certainly transformation? And are there similarly, are there similar parts of the book that you feel, whether in English or in French, you're worried that they won't translate?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, because it is an act of transformation for the screen, and especially for TV. You really have to keep the viewer engaged. I think for me, what would be most important beyond the themes is that the sensuality is carried through. The novel has a lot of descriptions of physical selves and food, and I always imagine it in my head as a very textured space, and I think that's something that could very well translate to the screen, but it would have to be someone who has that eye. So I don't know, I'm going to have very little control over any of this, but that would be my hope, that we get like the lusciousness of food and like the heat of Paris and all of that. And the rain as well, because the novel takes place over a year, so you get all of the seasons,
which are so vivid, living through them.
Yeah.
This is a question that I wanted to ask earlier, but since you've mentioned the sensuality, and it's bringing me back to this kind of area of questions I wanted to ask about the dreams in the novel, because there are a few kind of, I mean, the first chapter ends with a really intense dream. There's a kind of sexual dream, and then there's sex, very beautifully described as well. There's violent dreams. I mean, are you a big dreamer?
Oh, so no one has asked me about the dreams in the novel, which is very interesting that you are. And I remember a teacher in grad school who kept telling us to not write dreams because they're boring and they're digressions, and it's like he didn't want us to include too many flashbacks either. So I tried to keep them short, and I tried to be really purposeful when I included them. I am a big dreamer, very vivid dreamer, and unfortunately mostly nightmares. So maybe that's why you have some frightening dreams. I think especially at that age, I just like wanted to capture that intensity, and how the intensity also reflects in Margot's dreams. They are kind of violent, or they're not surreal. They feel very real to her, but they're kind of a manifestation of her fears and desires taken to another level.
Do you keep track of your dreams?
No, I don't. Sometimes I'll write them into my fiction, but I don't really have a dream diary. I just tell my husband about them. He's like, "Oh, there's so many nightmares."
Okay, lovely. Let me see if there's any more. Okay, yeah, this is a nice question about. So Emily would like to know, during the promotion of your book in the US, did people tend to see the story as stereotypically French? As it was a kind of, oh, here's another French man having an affair.
Yeah, I did get that question of, is this story particularly French, or is it a French thing to, have an affair? And I don't know the absolute answer to that, but I feel that affairs happen in all cultures, in all countries, and they are always incredibly painful and complicated. Maybe the perception of them is different, but I did get a lot of comments. I'm remembering, because I had forgotten about them, but at the beginning when the book came out in the US, that it was too French. Like, this was something that maybe alienated readers, or some of them thought that it was a translation. They were confused. Maybe that's the way that it had been positioned. I was very wary of stereotypes, and I mean, I had chosen Paris because it's the city that I knew the best when I started writing this book, and it really felt like home. And I wanted to focus on the characters and not on having to write a space that I didn't know. So it was very natural for me. But at the same time, Paris is a city that comes up so much in literature and film. And so I wanted to present my Paris and the textures of the Paris that I experienced, the dampness in the winter and the smell of roasted chicken, and like those little details that stick with you. And I was mostly nervous when the book came out here that maybe French readers would judge it and would feel that it wasn't the Paris that they knew. And so far that hasn't been the case, thankfully. But I don't know. I mean, I will be so curious to hear from all of you, because many of you are Americans living in Paris, or you're bicultural, or both worlds. And so I wonder how your experience will be of reading this novel written in English, but about a place that you probably know just as intimately.
Lovely. We have one more question, and that's obviously a great plug, because I before I get to the last question, if you don't have a copy of the book, here it is. Beautiful cover, anyway, we can say. And apparently the cover was inspired by French New Wave posters.
Yes.
Yeah. And you mentioned, we didn't even talk about the films that you mentioned in the book, but fantastic film selection. We didn't even talk about the food, but
that's okay.
These are all teasers for people who, if you haven't bought the book, please go to your your local bookshop and buy it, or order it online from a non-commercial site. This will be my final question, Sanaë, because it's a repeat question. So somebody posted, I didn't see it, so they're repeating. Hillary would like to know, and this is very, very specific. She says, please, can you give some examples of the dialogue in English that you want to sound French? Do you use French words and French constructions?
Yeah, so I think that there aren't a lot of French words in the book, actually. I don't know, Alice, what you thought, but yeah, I didn't want the book to be peppered with French words because I didn't want to alienate anyone who doesn't speak French, and my goal wasn't, and I also sometimes, to me, that can be a little jarring because it's a reminder of another language. However, there are a couple of words, so specifically words around Margot's lycée experience. Actually, I think the word lycée as opposed to high school is there. There are certain words that to me sound very American or Anglophone that I didn't want to include in the book. I want it to be kind of a more neutral English. And if I couldn't find the word, then I would include it in French. I referred to the end of the year exam as the bac or the baccalaureate, as opposed to end of the year exam. I always call the parents mother or father because in my mind, mom, M-O-M, and dad just, I don't know, they felt more Americanized, and I mean, it was probably just personal. But so it was kind of those decisions. And then in the dialogue, I couldn't point to a specific moment, but I remember, especially in one of the early chapters, there's a dialogue between Margot and David, who is the journalist that she ends up speaking to. The very first time they meet, they're going back and forth in conversation. And that's a section where I played around with saying a sentence in French and seeing how I would translate it into English. So when you read the book, or if you read it, that could be a fun place to, go back to. And then there were certain words that I tried to capture or not perfectly translate, but that I wanted to have in the book, like the word bouleversement, which I love. And I couldn't quite find, I guess, upheaval, but it's not quite right in English. And so it was more that I would have this emotion or this word in French, and I was trying to find ways to infuse the text with it, if that makes sense.
Totally. And actually I found a really perfect example towards the end, because this kind of character, this idea doesn't even exist in English. Gardienne.
Yes.
You say the gardienne struck me as a woman who overshared and knew the secrets of each inhabitant in the building. I mean, and that's in italics. Yeah, that's a great question. There are others, but you'll have to get the book yourself, Hillary, and then you can go through and
I actually I signed, because I'm in Paris right now for a couple of weeks, and I signed a bunch of copies at Shakespeare & Co. It's a different cover, don't be surprised, it's the UK version, so it just different colors, it looks different, but it's the same text inside.
Lovely. Well, Sanaë, thank you so much for being here this evening. It was such a pleasure to host you.
Thank you, and thank you for your incredible questions. So many of them were completely new. I had never heard them, which is
I'm glad. Well, I did my research. Elaine taught me well.